All right, welcome to the Mystic and the Skeptic. This evening we're going to be discussing The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. This is a book by John Allegro. John Allegro was one of the scholars associated with the translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're not familiar with them, they were discovered in 1947. Very shortly thereafter, the Roman Catholic Church and some other people, they put together a team to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in that process, John Allegro was one of the people who was selected. He was a professor at Oxford University, an archaeologist, and also an etymologist. And over his time working with the Dead Sea Scrolls and translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, he developed a what's considered to be a rather controversial theory about the Judaic and Christian cults. The personification of, or the person of Jesus within the Dead Sea Scrolls as compared to the New Testament. After his time translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, his work was this Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and some of the other things that he wrote were considered controversial because they were counter to the standard predominant narrative of Jesus, the historical Jesus, and the beginnings of Christianity. And so that's what we'll be discussing tonight. I find it to be a very interesting topic, and I find Allegro's theories to be rather compelling. Other information has come about over the years with respect to his theories. And there's quite a bit of information online as well with respect to his theory. And basically his theory is that Jesus in the New Testament and also within the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been based on an actual historical figure, but based on his studying of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he also believes that the name Jesus refers to the cultic use or the ritualistic use of the Amanita muscaria mushroom, known for its psychoactive properties. And so we'll get started. It interests me a lot about what John Allegro and other authors have talked about is this story I find to be very compelling because I have experience with psychedelics, and I've had experiences with psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, and also the Amanita muscaria. And in those experiences, I would term it, and others have termed it this way, and based on the readings that I've done over the years and different conversations I've had, my feeling is that the euphoria or the experience, the transcendental experience of psychedelics connects you to a deeper self, your cosmic self, the eternal soul that is a part of all of us, if you're going to put it in that way. The narrative that John Allegro weaves with respect to the New Testament and with respect to the ancient Sumerian fertility cults and the use of different plants by the fertility cults, and also by different religious groups throughout the world, or indigenous groups throughout the world, is that there's something to these substances that have a lot of power. And what I find compelling about John Allegro's theory is that the power of the substances in my mind, could very easily over time transform into a ritualistic religious type setting. And so I was raised Roman Catholic, and the story of like you had said, the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the original interpretation of these books based on the New Testament, which was compiled 200 or so years after the time of Christ, which is the theory. That story that I was taught as a Roman Catholic is in a lot of ways, in some ways it's similar, but in a lot of ways it's contradictory to these new theories that came about after the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the different Hebrew and Aramaic language within it, and in my mind, the story is important, and and it should be, as we evolve as a species in this story that has a very huge impact on our culture, as we evolve as humans and as a culture, it's important that we get as close to as possible to the original meaning or the original story, because I think that there's a lot of power in that. And for the longest time, the story and the narrative has been, in my mind, controlled by certain groups. And anything throughout history, throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the Renaissance, and even today, the story is anything that's counter to the official narrative is attacked or demonized or like, hey, let's just push this under the rug. And my thought is that it should be openly discussed, and we should delve into the mysteries and the power that brought these stories into being. I've had in our initial conversations, David and I have discussed it, and one of the things that David had said, which I agree with, is that the story that John Allegro puts forth within this book is somewhat outrageous. My thought was that yes, it is outrageous, but a lot of things that turn out to be true on a scientific level, or true after time has bared them out, more evidence comes in. A lot of those things that are initially outrageous over time become, generally accepted truths, or become a part of the story. So
I would like to share my perspective on this topic. I come from, well, let me tell you the story. When I grew up, I was studying about different religions, and I was an artist, and they showed us in high school a movie of Jean-Michel Basquiat. And I had a really hard time taking his life story seriously, because it was a story of him becoming a famous artist, but at the same time participating in different drugs, and then through the whole time not being able to tell the difference between reality and hallucinations, a fantasy, back and forth. And he got taken advantage of by the art community in the process, and then he died. So I remember one of my fellow artists say, so you only like drug-free artists? Because we had just seen another video of an artist who was taking LSD or cocaine, and he would make all these amazing art pieces. To bring it back to my perspective on this is that I feel that there's a way to connect with spirituality, there's a way to connect with what makes life meaningful without participating in those type of experiences. On the other hand, personal experiences are very important in educating our relationship to religion, to spirituality. So there's a back and forth regarding that, but I really feel that for us to take this book at face value, we have to assess it from the scientific method, from rational arguments. And the things that I keep on seeing in the book is that it goes a different route, because when you put it under peer review, and it was when it first came out, when you study it from the history of religions and just religious studies, a lot of the things that he's saying are not only contrary to mainstream perspective, but you can't even measure the stuff that he's saying because it's so conspiratorial. So I really want to get down to the facts behind the claims that he makes, both linguistically and historically, and from a religious studies perspective. And I don't want to sound biased or that I have something against the claims that he's making, but I want to make sure that if we put it under the microscope of those fields, that there are things that are very hard to prove, and we can make arguments on other things in the same way. So again, we want to have a very open discussion, an open way to look at it, but just to know that I'm coming from the perspective that I find a lot of things that he says problematic. Can you give us like an overview of the book and some of the claims? Yeah.
So John Allegro starts the book off with a discussion of the ancient Sumerian fertility cults. And in his discussion of the ancient Sumerian fertility cults, he talks about this belief that was common amongst those cults, that which is common amongst a lot of indigenous traditions and within a lot of mythical traditions about the creation of mankind, the creation of the earth, creation of animals and everything. And this particular group, which he theorizes was the beginning of the Judaic and Christian cults, had a certain anthropomorphication of God. And that's common amongst a lot of indigenous people to anthropomorphize God. And by anthropomorphication, for people who are not familiar with the term, that is taking human attributes and applying human attributes to something that's not human, like the cosmos or a plant. And so their belief was essentially that there was a sky penis God, and the rain that fell on the earth was the sky penis as God's semen, and the earth was the womb, was the woman. And in the creative process of life, the rain comes down, fertilizes the plants, that feeds the animals, and the humans feed out the plants and feed out the animals for survival. And within this cultic myth about the creation of man, the theory is that one of the ways that this group may have come up with this idea is through the ingestion of psychedelic plants. And the theory within his book and others that have talked about the subject is that the Amanita muscaria was the likely substance that they ingested, that gave them this belief in God and in creation and all these things. And they further anthropomorphized God in this idea of the creation myth in the image of the mushroom, which was the mushroom the substance that gave them this idea. And so the mushroom took on its own symbolism within these cults. And if you're thinking about over a thousand year periods of time, these cults became to be more ritualistic. They had their own customs within the cults, and then over time it morphed into established religions. And then it goes beyond that, and he explains how the Judaic religion and also the Christian cults were their predecessors, or the tradition that they came from were these ancient Sumerian cults. And the way that he comes to this theory is he was an etymologist, and etymology is studying the relationship between different languages. So the Semitic languages of Hebrew and Aramaic, their common source was Sumerian. And so he had knowledge of the Sumerian language already. That's why he was selected to be a part of this team to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were predominantly in Hebrew and Aramaic. And through this process, he's finding these connections between Sumerian words that were used within these fertility cults and names within the New Testament, and names within different names of the different prophets, the names of the apostles, the names of Jesus, the name of Jesus himself. And he connects these names to Sumerian root words, which relate to life-giving semen, or the different Sumerian names for the mushroom. He further develops this based on those translations that he was working on. He started connecting the dots to not only the Christian and Judaic fertility cults, but other fertility cults throughout the world. And he focuses on the talk of the soma within the Rig Vedas, and different theories have been that soma was like a drink that was drunk by initiates within the religion that brought the Rig Vedas into being. And the theory is that the soma was a mixture of different psychoactive plants, and that there was ritualistic use of this soma, and the names for soma and the different plants that were involved with the mixture of soma are also within the Bible, within the New Testament. And so connecting it with the development of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, he kind of paints this narrative of what was happening during the time of Christ, during the time of this figure of Christ. And what he says is that during that time there were a number of Jewish and Christian cults that existed in Jerusalem at the time when the Romans took over and were occupying Jerusalem. And there's a historical period of time during the 60 to 70 AD where there was a Jewish revolt. There was a revolt against the Roman occupation. And his theory is that the Romans, because of this revolt, were cracking down on the different Jewish groups and also the Christian sects. And his theory is that they were forced to put their oral tradition, their oral fertility cult tradition into writing. And they did it in such a way that was common with a lot of mythical writings. They used wordplay, and they used different symbolism and cryptological symbolism to express their teachings, so that the only people who could understand it were the people who had some knowledge of this cult, the initiates, or people who were actually literate. Because at the time, most people weren't literate, as opposed to today. So he weaves this narrative of this kind of conflict between certain sects, and there was some sects that sided with the Romans because they figured it was probably a good way for them to survive, and there were some sects that were completely against the Romans. So there's two different narratives of Jesus now. You have the narrative of the New Testament, which is Jesus, this peaceful person who was friendly to the Romans. The narrative of Jesus within the Dead Sea Scrolls is completely opposite. He has a peaceful mindset about life, but he's also a revolutionary figure. Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls is presented as this leader who is very upset with the Roman occupation. He's upset. This group is also upset with the siding of certain of their brothers with the Romans, and so that Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a revolutionary figure. He wants to go fight the Romans, and the theory, and also within the Dead Sea Scrolls, it talks about how there was multiple Jesus figures, multiple people who rose up against the Roman occupation and were crucified as a result. And the word Christian, he connects it back to the Sumerian roots, and the word Christian means it's a Greek word, Christos. It's come from because the New Testament was written in Greek, or compiled in Greek based on Aramaic and Hebrew, and so Christian means the anointed one. And just to go back a little bit, the theory is that the Dead Sea Scrolls were compiled and written by the Essenes. A very fundamentalist group that practice abstinence from sexual intercourse. They were also known as healers. They had a knowledge of the healing power of psychoactive plants and different plants. And the tradition amongst the Essenes is that they would go into the city, the cultural centers, the city centers, and heal and spread their message. And so the theory is that the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essenes, and they wrote it to protect their knowledge of the plants. And so through a series of, this whole book is essentially just connecting the names within the Bible with different plant names. And he refers to the historians Pliny and Josephus to kind of weave this narrative. And so his theory is that there was two different groups of Christians, two predominant groups of Christians that survived the Roman occupation and survived the Roman strike against the Christians. It's the one group that was friendly to the Romans, and the other group that was forced underground because of their practices and because of their teachings, their anti-Roman teachings. And so later on in history, you have the compilation of the New Testament books in 200 AD or so, and then later on you have the Roman Emperor Constantine adopting Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so what he's basically saying is that during this time, this very tumultuous time, there was a lot of things lost about the original knowledge of these people, the original practices of these people, because they were forced underground. And the predominant theory of Christ, or the predominant history of Christian religion, is that Jesus was friendly to the Romans. That morphed into the Roman Catholic Church. During the Reformation, people broke off from the Roman Catholic Church, and here we are today. And what's interesting about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that when they were translating these, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, was very surprised at what they were finding out. They were hoping that because this was an earlier writing at the time of the Jewish revolt, that it would confirm the story of the New Testament, the story of Jesus in the New Testament. Well, it was actually opposite of the official narrative of Jesus. And for a long time, the church kept a lot of the different segments of the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were afraid of the impact that it might have. And it wasn't until the 1990s, by just some happenstance scholar in a library, where he found these on a shelf somewhere. And then that's when it all came to light again. And so, getting back to what I was saying earlier, for me it's important to understand the root of these religions, and to have an idea of maybe a different narrative or a different story about what Christ was about and what these early religions were about, because religion is very important within our culture. It has a lot of power, and the narrative of Jesus within that context has a lot of power. And if our original interpretation, or the political interpretation of Jesus, is not correct, then I think it's important that this alternative theory is brought into light.
After studying religion for 10 years, you come to that point where you're like, there's amazing things you can learn from different things. There's also horrible things you find out. You see the conflict that goes on, and then there's a point where you say, you know what, I just want to help people. I just want to make a difference. And if this form of religion, spirituality, can make me a better person, that's wonderful. But if after you consume it or are part of it, you come out worse, then you know that it's not healthy. But the conversation we're having today about the book is that part of the show's purpose is to still have a objective understanding of truth, and looking at are things reasonable, are things comprehensible, are things compelling. And I think that people's personal experience, and also getting burned out with all of this stuff, is very important. My concern with the book comes from some of the liberties that he takes. It's kind of like artistic liberty. So one of the problems I would mention is kind of his obsession with sexualizing the Bible. One example is that he writes, there's this passage in the Bible where Moses comes from the mountain after seeing God, and he has a covering over his face. Well, he takes that to mean that the covering is a symbol of the uncircumcised phallus. And in Jewish sources, the circumcision is the size of the covenant of Sinai, and without it you can't experience God. So he's actually using a symbol that is not part of Jewish religion to push his claim. And then he talks about the phallus over and over again. But the phallus was a symbol of the Canaanites, who were the enemies of the Israelites. And a lot of people would say that historically, when they were writing the story, they were writing in opposition to the other groups. So there is connections between the Sumerians and the different groups with the ancient Hebrews and Israelites, but a lot of the books were written in conflict, or in opposition to some of the things that they found conflictive. So the idea of God in the Bible is that he is genderless. Even though they use male language for him as a ruler, a sovereign, all these masculine terms have to do a lot with the language. Just like in Spanish, some things are arbitrarily male or female. Back then, those terms were male or female, and they had a strong patriarchal system. So that's where a lot of stuff comes from. In psychology, they say that it has to do with people having father issues or sexual issues, stuff like that, when they try to look at the Bible. But if you look at it from its original intent, and even now as we study from a scholar perspective, this parallel mania where we try to connect every religion with every other religion, when we know that a lot of the things they're saying are conflictive and self-exclusive, to me that's one of the issues. The second issue is that there is a vast conspiracy in his perspective. In page 20, he says that Christianity under its various names had been thriving for centuries before the church, and as we now appreciate, it was a more original code that was driven underground by the combined efforts of the Roman, Jewish, and ecclesiastical authorities. It was the supreme heresy which made terms with secular powers and became the church of today. So to him, the Romans, the Jews, and the early church all had it against the original writers of the Bible. Again, if you compare what Romans were saying about Christians, what Jews were saying about Christians, what Christians were saying about Christians, with what he's saying, there's very little evidence, because you have people who have issues with the first Christians, and some of them are saying that they're doing things that are bad for the Roman Empire. The Jewish community has issues with them making splinter groups that are walking away from the overall nation. And then the ecclesiastical authorities were actually supporting the case for a new religion to take over the world. So he has this, like, everybody's trying to come after his claim, but again, we have to look at his claim. The next point, in the Bible, there's 115 plants mentioned, and they never mention mushrooms. And out of those plants, there's a couple that could be considered to have some type of hallucinogenic or psychotropic aspects, but they're not used in that form in the Bible. So acacia is used to build the Ark of the Covenant. Well, acacia was the only tree that was available in the desert, and they weren't smoking it, they weren't talking about smoking it. So when you look at all the plants that are mentioned, not all of them have to do with supernatural experiences. Some of them are just mentioned, like somebody was passing by a tree, or they grabbed a fruit or something. So everything has to relate to plants that bring about some mystical experience is problematic. The next one, the people in the Dead Sea community, they weren't Gnostics, they were apocalyptic triumphalists like the Apostle Paul. So these were people who, instead of living in the mountains because they wanted to keep this tradition alive, they were living in the mountains because they felt that the world was going to hell and that they needed to protect themselves against the end of the world. So, and their knowledge was something that was available to everyone in that group, and it was knowledge that had to do with the scriptures. It had to do with their interpretation of the scriptures. It had nothing to do with having secret meetings and secret societies and stuff like that. That's something that later on has become very popular in modern culture, to try to kind of say that everything has this hidden agenda, but they were separate because they didn't like what was going on in the rest of the community, and they had their own practices. But when you read the practices, they all have to do with prayer, with piety, with doing community work. The next one is that I've read 4 books about the Dead Sea Scroll, and none of them have to do with Jesus or the early Jesus followers. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group of Pharisees who left the temple because it had been corrupted by the Romans and the Sadducees, and they had their own community. So this idea that Jesus had something to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the idea that the Catholic Church is keeping the Dead Sea Scrolls to hide the true nature of Jesus. Jesus is not mentioned. There's a leader that is mentioned, and most scholars say they had nothing to do with Jesus. It was a previous leader that had to do with the Sadducees. And the Catholic Church had a hold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some Protestant scholars did too. And they fought with the Israeli government for a lot of years to publish them. So then finally the Israeli community was able to get a hold of them, and they were the ones that printed them and got them out. But it was because they were taking forever to translate them. So once they got out, there was also this idea that the Christians were defining the people of the Dead Sea as monks or as other things, but those are fabrications. The people in that community were devout Jews, and they were fighting against the forces that were going on at that time. So there was no the only reason they didn't have many women in the group, and there is some tombs where they found women and children, is because they were fleeing from the Romans. And then the idea of them being healers is also problematic, because in none of the writings they talk about amulets or any magical stuff. They were very strict. They had issues against the occult, just like the early Israelites. So, and then the term cult means that a group of people are following a charismatic leader, or have this very kind of conflictive idea towards the mainstream religion. Both Judaism and Christianity, I guess when they started, they were cultic because they were separate from the other religions, but they have become world religions. So the term cult gives it this aura of it being hidden and mystical and stuff like that, but they're not cults. They're world religions. They're well established. They have parameters and ways to measure them, and they could be the early version of it, but it's still within a world religion. The idea of the people from the Dead Sea Scroll community having any type of connection with some type of potion, stuff like that. The only thing that I found in the Bible is the anointing oil for the priest, and that's something that we're talking about, the Christ figure. Anointing oil, most of the elements in the anointing oil that we still know about from Judaism and biblical archaeology, they were all fragrances. They were like frankincense and things like that, that all they do is like mellow you out. They don't put you in a trance or put you in an ecstatic kind of perspective. And that's something important. I also wanted to say that from the research of scholars, Judaism and the ancient Judaism, there is no evidence that it was an ecstatic religion, that it had to do with connecting with some type of altered state. This is a quote from Alan Brill. By the 1920s and 1930s, after collecting data in oracles, meditation, and shamanism, scholars consider the category of revelatory religion to be exclusive domain of the Semites. So what they're saying is that if you compare what people were doing in South America, what people were doing in Native Americans, people in India, to what was going on in the Middle East, it's completely different. Their form of revelation, their form of connecting with the elements or God has different parameters and different ways to deal with that knowledge of the eternal, or this awe of the universe. So to just say that all of them believe in the same things, all of them held plants in the same high esteem, is just this blanket mixing of things that Joseph Campbell was famous for doing, but that when it really get down to it, they're very separate, and that's what makes them unique. Same with the Christians. The reason that the Christians became their own religion from Judaism is because they had a unique message. This idea that Jesus was a revolutionary is very problematic. Why? Because all the leaders who came up with the pacifist movement, they were quoting Jesus, Gandhi, Thoreau, MLK, and he was known for being pacifistic. So this idea that he was a revolutionary, and this is something that Reza Aslan does in his book Sell It, goes against everything that Christianity claims and what made Christianity unique and compelling to the people in the Roman Empire. They were tired of revolutionaries. They had Spartacus, they had all kinds of people fighting against the Romans. They had a figure who was all about peaceful resistance, and that's what made their message unique. So to start mixing everything up and try and portray things to meet the expectations of the writer, I think that's what I really struggle with.